The birthday had just passed, and yet again he was the only one who couldn't. He sat on his bed, picking at the polish on the nail he had painted for the party. Why couldn't he find his? Everyone else had found their special thing that at that special time would let them through the gate. Everyone, but the Prince of the Kingdom, could travel to the dreamland. What would happen if this waking curse could never be broken? The prince's head fell to the pillow as soon as his lips left the bottle. His father and the physician stood over him and watched. It seemed the concoction had put him to sleep. However, it wasn't long before his eyes shot open and his scream filled the mansion's corridors. The father rushed to his side to comfort him, and the physician to the other to check on him. Once the prince was calmed, the physician hung his head in apology, gathered his supplies, and left. The prince just whispered, "I saw them." His father slides an old book across the table. There may be another way to reach the gate. The prince flips the book open to a marked section to see prints of a tower and a large vehicle next to it facing up to the sky. It will be a slow process, but if you can hold on to your grace. The prince looks over the pages, unsure. I understand this has been a struggle, and it's an uphill battle from here. I ask you to keep fighting. 443,884 people died that Thursday, the prince read, flipping through stacks of old books with pictures of large cities and machines as unique as the shuttle they now worked on. One told a story of his people's adoption by a race of beings who had since disappeared themselves. Where was all this before now, this library he now sat in, the man who led them here and treated his father so casually? At this point, he was just shifting the papers and books around, unable to take in any more of this. This job was taken from him when the rattling windows burst open, blowing any loose papers to the floor. The winds had been blowing harder as the stormy season began to move in. Deciding it was time to go, he latched the window, cleaned up, and descended the staircase to the sound of clanging echoing through the walls. Outside the entrance, a city of stone, glass, and metal covered in vines takes over his view. Turning back, he sees the giant clock tower, scaffolding attached to the side, and workers hammering the vaguest of shapes out of the metal framework. The storms raged for months, clouds rarely parting but the stars that did poke through tempting him back to the tower. Night after night, while others did their sleeping, he would gather a disguise and head to the tower. His father, trying to temper his obsession, locked the tower, and relocked it every time he would break through. One calm night, every star shining, he takes out a small square magnifier he found in the tower and points it towards the brightest star in the sky. In the office at the top of the tower, he stands in front of the magnifying device. He had seen the word camera referenced next to similar pictures in the books. He shifted the camera around on the stand until it was facing the brightest and biggest star, the one placed above their kingdom. He leaned down and put his eye up to the viewer. At first, it was a blur of lights and darks, like looking through a warped funhouse window. He twisted the front of it to focus and zoom into the star. Across the surface, something was moving. The image sharpened, and it was a hand. Something was waving. He stumbled back, tripping and landing flat on the floor. The prince stood at the base of his bed, looking over the blankets peeling and matted from the pets that used it more than him. He pulled in all he had learned from the last few months, an old enemy of his father's that he would be coming face to face with, the ones who bear the insults his father placed on them, as well as this fateful friend who he had never met and had sworn so much to secrecy. And then there was the ship they had spent all this time building. It could get him to his final goal, or become a coffin for him and the few who risked traveling with him. In only a few hours, he bids his father farewell, having forbid the old man from the journey. He finally enters the land everyone else has dreamt of, but he could only see in his wildest daydreams. He stood at the base of the tower, staring at the giant metal contraption they had cobbled together. It faced upwards to its destination, the great star that dwarfed all others. There were dozens of people hanging off of it, looking into panels, checking connections and wiring. Books were laid out at the table near the base. They contained info on the technology they were mimicking. Although the words looked familiar, it might as well have been in a different language. Someone calls to him, and a small rope ladder is dropped down the side of the machine. Climbing up into a small cabin, his father's friend hands him a pamphlet. His notes, simplified and narrowed down to focus on a small panel with more buttons than the prince would have liked to see. The metals and crystals of the cabin rumble as the kingdom disappears behind them. His father's friend and his two assistants work in unison with the buttons, switches, and levers as they fly to the final goal. The prince helped here and there with his panel. When told he pushes a button, his nails painted as if going to the sleepover and not to a whole new world. Although the blue, swirling spirits of his people flowing around the ship reminded him that they were headed to the same destination. While traveling, the prince told the man he wants to know the whole story. It's an old story. It was exactly 128 years and 50 days ago. The man paused, fingers on the controls but not pressing any, searching for the right words. A story of love and hate brought us into a new era. A blanket drops to the grass. A pair of brothers take the corners, spread it out, and move to get comfortable when a third man approaches. A young king. One of the brothers shoots up to embrace him. The king hugs him back and greets the other brother. They take their place on the blanket. Blue wisps rise from them until a voice breaks through. You were given a new paradise, but your obsession with the old prevents you from creating something new. And it seems the temptation is just too much for you. A pair of sharp eyes appear over the surface of the great star. Embrace the present. The eyes glance over to the man the king held. There can be so little of it left. A threat? Accused his brother. Only advice, says the voice as the eyes drift down away from the star silhouette. Hexen, the king hissed. Proof you hold on to the past too tightly. Let the next generation be a lesson in moving on. The sky darkened with storm clouds, shrouding the great star and the old paradise from view as the eyes melted away into the shadows of the trees. As they approached, a fire blazed around their vessel. The metal and gemstone controls of the cabin reflected it, and lights danced around the cabin as it rumbled. Beyond the blaze was a landscape of green that stretched forever, unlike the cracked white land that surrounded his home, and a familiar shadowy hand reached up to meet them. As the ship's rumbling settled around him, his thoughts rattled on, with hopes of healing and wholeness holding tight. They headed towards the large white castle across the field. Joining them was the sounds of battle and screams and the occasional ghostly shadow. Silhouettes resembling themselves cut down those with more exotic shapes with rough edges, wings, and fins. Arriving at the castle, a woman in golden robes read from a scroll. As soon as her voice stopped, so did the sounds of battle. Led inside, they entered a grand banquet hall, a long table filled with foods at the center and walls lined with landscapes of green forests, molten rocks, and stormy skies. Seated were 6 beings with animalistic and elemental features, who turned to face the group. 2 of them immediately stood up and left through another door with scowls on their faces. Those that remained shifted spots, opening up seats between them, so the arrangement would be one of them and one of the prince's group. A creature with horns jutting from their head and a muscular frame far too large for the elegant chairs gestured for the prince to sit next to them. His father's friend, whom he now knew as his uncle, sat next to one of nearly equal size, and metal plating on their body arced with electricity. Finally, his uncle's assistants were seated next to the smallest, childlike in size, with no facial features other than eyes to be seen, and the most animalistic, a black panther sitting upright with perfect posture. Let's lay everything out. The panther's voice barely reached across the table. What does your people remember? The prince speaks up. From what I've read, for many years our people lived in harmony, until one day your people fired upon mine. In one day nearly 500,000 people died. The message spread quickly, and soon there was all-out war. Such blatant lies, they responded gently. Time can twist the truth, but time can also heal. That is the only reason you're at this table. Count yourself lucky. The panther's sharp eyes focused in on the prince as they continued. Details of who was cut down first have been lost to history, so I won't pretend to know. What is clear is your kind took from us. A few things at first, then one more thing, and one more thing. A war began, and your people were stubborn. The only thing that would stop you would be divine intervention. So we created a third party, a sacred being to bring you to a new life. Our battles had drained us, but we managed to reflect enough power of the moon to create a pathway. A new world was born. The ground itself shifted and turned, details chosen specifically to make you happy. The prince notices a glint from his uncle's direction as his hand reaches behind him, a fire rising in his eyes. The prince turns back to see the panther's eyes hadn't wavered as he continued. The environment turned on its head to allow life to thrive. A crashing of plates, and his uncle leaps onto the table and towards the panther, blade in hand. And it began. His uncle, seeing red, slashed at the panther, drawing blood from his arm. A flash of gold, and he was stumbling backwards, a wound across his shoulder. The faceless child stood on the table, the man's blood darkening the tip of their blade and running down the length of it. The uncle tried to repeat his attack, but surprise was his only advantage. Lightning streamed through the room, and a flash of flowers and a splash of water, they found themselves outside again, bobbing near the shoreline of a lake just outside the castle. "You haven't learned a thing." The quiet voice of the panther came from across the field, carried by the wind. The uncle drags himself out onto the shore, shouting in reply, "I can remember that night. I remember those cold eyes. You sentenced my brother to death." His uncle rushed forward, but after a few paces found himself flat on his back. Looking across to the four beings leaving the castle, the slightest twisting of their image revealed a barrier between the two groups. "Thank you for joining us for lunch," the panther addressed the uncle. "While you're here, we'd like to take this opportunity to reorganize the setup we made for you. We understand your people are enjoying a visit. Let's bring them here to keep you company." With a rush of wind, the blue swirling spirits of his people began to pop up around the field. They had accompanied them on their journey here until the hand pulled their ship away. The prince realized that after all this, he still hadn't made it through the gate with them. Instead, he stood on a field where whispers began to bring back the shadows of a battle. His people ran from towering silhouettes and flinched at ethereal blades being swung around them. The prince stood on the shore, a full thought failing to form, as this was further beyond anything he had prepared for in his mind. While looking on, the edges of the scene became fuzzy. The images, already distorted by the barrier, continued to twist and spread. Everything blurred except for the unwavering eyes of the panther, who still glared down at his uncle. When everything snapped back into focus, it was no longer shadows and spirits in front of him. It was real people and real half-people and beasts charging at one another. He looked around at himself and his companions, all dressed in armor, ready for battle. There was a splash behind them, and a large metal fish leaps out of the waters. It flies at speed, raining metal spheres down on the field, thunder crashing as they landed. They fought and survived, encountering all forms of clawed, winged, and raging beasts. They were on that battlefield for hours, until suddenly they weren't. A crashing of dishes breaks the prince from his thoughts. A few staff rush to clean things up, the smallest pieces are swept under a rug, and the plates that survived are shuffled back into a pile on a tray. His attention returns to his table and his thoughts to that green paradise. He sips on his drink and thinks about the land across the stars, now hidden by a haze of bright blue in the sky. He thinks about the one question he got to answer, the many he never got to ask, and all the extra time everyone else will have to question that day as they join him in a kingdom that never sleeps.